I never imagined my life would unravel so quickly, that the world I thought was solid beneath my feet would collapse in a matter of days. My name is Sophia, and I was married to a man I thought I knew, with a sister I believed I could trust. But sometimes, the people closest to you hide the darkest secrets. It started with small things. A missed phone call, a vague excuse, a look that lingered too long. My husband, Daniel, had always been attentive, or at least, I believed he was. But lately, there was something different in his eyes, a tension I couldn't place, a distance I couldn't ignore. My sister, Lila, who I had loved and protected all my life, seemed different too. Too familiar with his quirks, too comfortable in our home. I remember the first time I felt the sting of suspicion. It was a Thursday evening. I had been preparing dinner, the aroma of roasted chicken filling the kitchen, when I noticed Daniel's phone buzzing on the counter. Normally, I wouldn't have cared, but something urged me to glance at the screen. A message preview flashed across the screen. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you." My heart stopped. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles whitened. I wanted to scream, to confront him immediately, but a strange calm washed over me. I couldn't let him know I had seen it. Not yet. I needed proof. Solid evidence, because if I acted too soon, if I let emotion dictate my actions, I could ruin everything, and I needed this to be precise, devastating, irreversible. Over the next few days, I started watching them. I was careful, subtle. Every glance, every casual comment was catalogued in my mind like a forensic investigator collecting clues. I watched Daniel texting secretly, slipping away on supposed work errands, and Lila always conveniently around at those times. My sister, who I had once idolized, was now a stranger wearing the face of betrayal. One night, I followed Daniel to a small, dimly lit cafe on the edge of town. From the shadows, I watched them together, my husband and my sister, laughing, touching hands under the table. My stomach churned. I felt the icy grip of betrayal squeezing my chest. How could they do this? How could they betray me so utterly, so flagrantly? I didn't rush home. I didn't confront them. I sat there in the darkness, feeling every inch of my anger building like a storm waiting to explode. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about trust, about family, about the life I had built and the foundation they were trying to burn down. That night, as I drove home, my mind was a hurricane of emotions. Anger. Sadness. Vengeance. And then, a strange clarity settled over me. I realized that the only way to win this was to play the long game. I had to be patient. I had to be smarter than both of them. I had to take control of the narrative before they destroyed everything I loved. I started documenting everything. Screenshots, recordings, photographs. I became meticulous, almost obsessive. I wasn't doing this out of spite alone, I was doing it to protect myself, to reclaim my life, and to make sure they understood the weight of their betrayal. But life, as it often does, had another plan. A week later, a fire broke out in the house across the street. I was walking home when I saw the smoke curling into the night sky, black and menacing. People were screaming, neighbors running out of their homes in terror. I ran toward the chaos, heart pounding, until I realized it was Daniel and Lila's house engulfed in flames. My stomach dropped. My mind screamed in disbelief. No, this can't be happening. I tried to get inside, but the fire was too intense. The fire department arrived, sirens blaring, hoses spraying torrents of water, but it was futile. My sister. My husband. My family. Gone. Or so I thought. Amid the horror, I saw a small figure in the window, crying, trapped. It was Ethan, the 5-year-old son of Daniel from a previous marriage, a boy I had come to care for like my own. The neighbors were helpless. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I forced my way past the firefighters, ignoring their shouts, diving through the smoke. I remember grabbing him, holding him tight, coughing from the smoke, tears streaming down my face. I could feel his tiny body shaking, and I whispered promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "It's okay, I've got you. I won't let anything happen to you." That night, as the house burned to ashes, something inside me changed. The world I knew was gone, replaced by a raw, unrelenting reality. Daniel and Lila's betrayal didn't matter anymore, not in the way it had before. Now, I had a purpose. A child to protect. A life to rebuild. And a revenge to plan. Because I realized something essential: if they thought they could hurt me and get away with it, they had no idea what I was capable of. I could feel it now, the dark pulse of determination surging through my veins. I would take care of Ethan. I would build a life for him. And I would make sure that Daniel and Lila's names were forever tainted by the ruin they created. I looked at Ethan's tear-streaked face and whispered, almost to myself, "They took everything from me. But they didn't take you. And I swear, they will pay for this." It was the first night of a new life. The night I became more than just a betrayed wife and sister. The night I became a mother, a guardian, and a force they would never see coming. And I knew, deep in my heart, that the storm had only just begun. After the fire, everything moved in a blur that felt both too fast and unbearably slow. There were police reports, interviews, a parade of neighbors who said they'd seen nothing, and then the questions, the ones that never stop when a life ruptures into pieces. Someone had to sign forms. Someone had to answer who would look after Ethan. Someone had to decide what to do with the wreckage of a house and the weight of 2 dead names. They treated me like I was fragile, like a woman who'd lost everything. They didn't know that while my body shook and the smoke still smelled in my hair, a part of me had already begun to organize itself into a plan. Trauma had sharpened me rather than dulled me. Grief narrowed my world to one bright, terrible thing: protect this child, and do not let the truth be buried with the ashes. At the hospital, Ethan slept fitfully, tubes and bandages a roadmap of the night. He was small and burned and brave in ways no 5-year-old should be. When he opened his eyes and blinked at me with all the trust in the world, something hard and fierce swelled inside me. I held his hand and promised, word by word, that I would not let him fall through the cracks of a life that had been careless with him. The police ruled the fire accidental at first, an electrical fault, a careless cigarette. But I was not satisfied with convenient answers. The timing felt wrong, the little inconsistencies whispering in my head like a chorus. The week before, Daniel had argued on the phone about insurance, someone had been seen taking pictures of the property days earlier, and Lila had been acting strangely docile the last time I'd seen her. When your world has already cracked because 2 people closest to you have betrayed you, your senses get very good at reading tiny fractures. So I did what I knew how to do: I looked for proof. There were things you can't burn. Digital footprints, for one. Daniel's phone had been found in the rubble, its screen spiderwebbed but still clinging to life. I kept it in my purse like a dangerous relic while the investigators catalogued the rest. At night, when Ethan slept and the house was quiet except for the hum of the radiator and the distant city noises, I would sit at the kitchen table with the dead phone and force myself to be methodical. I was a detective now, cold, patient, relentless. I pulled up old messages, cached attachments, call logs. I learned the rhythm of their deceit: late-night texts, deleted threads, photos shared and then purged. But deletion is never complete. Data clings like dust. I recovered images, screenshots of clandestine lunches, a voice note where Lila laughed into Daniel's ear, a photo from the cafe where I had watched them, taken from a different angle that made my stomach drop. There were receipts for flowers, hotel bookings under fake names, a string of excuses neatly packaged like alibis. The proof piled up in a file on my laptop that I labeled with a single word: irrefutable. I printed the crucial pieces and made copies. I didn't show them to anyone. Not yet. Secrets are weapons. You don't let the other side see them before you decide to strike. While I gathered evidence, the community rallied. Candles appeared on the neighbor's stoop, prayers were murmured at a funeral that smelled of lilies and polite sympathy. At the funeral, hands reached for mine with condolences so empty they hurt. People said how brave I was for adopting Ethan, how noble it was to take the boy in, and I smiled with a mouth that didn't reach my eyes. I accepted the sympathy because I needed the cover. If a woman with a child looks small and vulnerable, people open doors for her. If she looks broken, they hand her money. I learned how to use the world's assumptions as a kind of camouflage. Adoption papers were complicated. The court system moves like a tired beast, sluggish, bureaucratic, but predictable. I hired an attorney, a discreet man with gray hair who spoke in reassuring tones. He helped me navigate probate issues and temporary guardianship. I signed forms. I learned about what the law would consider Ethan's rightful inheritance and how the estate of the burned house would be settled. There were condolence funds set up online, messages from people who had once called themselves friends, and an outpouring that, on the surface, made me look like the grieving, noble savior of an orphaned boy. Underneath that public face, I worked in silence. The files I had recovered revealed more than an illicit affair. They hinted at greed. There were documents, drafted wills, emails about liquidating assets, plans to move away. One message in particular made me reel, a forwarded email with an attached life insurance policy, the beneficiary listed as L. Hayes. Lila. The policy had been taken out months earlier and had a clause that would double the payout in the event of accidental death. My hands went cold. Coincidence? Maybe. Maybe not. I fed the suspicion into the slow machinery of officialdom without seeming hysterical. I handed my digital cash to the detective assigned to the fire under the guise of cooperating fully. He had dark eyes that watched me with a mixture of curiosity and something like pity. He read my printouts with that careful, dispassionate look of someone who has seen too many tragedies. "We'll take another look," he said, which is the phrase investigators use when you put enough pressure on the right places. While the police ran their checks, I crafted a different strategy, one that would not rely solely on law enforcement. I had learned long ago that justice, legal or moral, is often messy and slow. If I wanted a reckoning that would sting, that would ripple beyond the paperwork in the courtroom, I needed to strike where it would hurt most: reputations, livelihoods, and the people who still believed in Daniel and Lila. I reached out to people who mattered, the employer Daniel had bragged about, the old college friends who still followed Lila's Instagram like a shrine. I sent innocuous messages, feigning ignorance, letting casual, well-placed questions loosen a few threads. Curiosity spreads fast among people who love gossip. The lies people tell to cover for loved ones are fragile under scrutiny. I made sure the right glances would be cast in the right directions. At the same time, I built Ethan's new world. I made a phone call to a pediatric therapist and scheduled appointments. I bought him toys that didn't smell like hospitals. We painted his room a brave, sunlight yellow, and I told him stories about how brave he'd been. Each night, when he fell asleep against my chest, I felt a quietness that was not peace but a different kind of power, responsibility fused with resolve. There were nights I couldn't sleep because the questions tormented me. Had they planned this? Had greed or anger led them into some reckless act? Or was the fire a terrible accident, a final, ironical end to a life of secret selfishness? I wanted the answers not for closure but to construct the most effective retribution. Revenge, I had decided, would be a process, not a spectacle, patient, systemic, and surgical. I also found pockets of mercy inside myself. Ethan's small hand curled around my finger and I thought of what justice should mean for him: safety, a home, the truth without cruelty, a future that didn't revolve around his parents' final mistake. That became my North Star. My revenge could not simply be spite, it had to ensure that the people who had done wrong would not be able to harm any more lives. It had to protect. So I set two agendas. 1. The quiet, official path: cooperate with investigators, hand over evidence, press for a thorough examination of the fire. 2. The public, psychological path: dismantle their reputations gently but inexorably, cut off their social oxygen, and secure my son's position in a new life that would be full of love and truth. I kept the files, the screenshots, the receipts, all cataloged and backed up in a hidden cloud. I printed a stack of copies and placed them in an envelope I labeled with a single word on the outside: when. It was a promise, and a plan. I did not know yet when the world would tilt in the way I intended, but I knew how to wait, with a patience that had the edges of steel. Grief taught me an odd thing: it sharpens the will. It focuses you on what matters and strips away what doesn't. For me, what mattered was clear, Ethan, the truth, and making sure that the betrayal that had set this whole disaster into motion would not go unpunished. I tucked the envelope into the drawer beneath the kitchen table, kissed the top of Ethan's head as he slept that night, and whispered into the darkness, "I will make this right. I will not let their lies be the last story he knows." The thing about grief is that it carves a hollow you either fall into or fill with something else. I chose to fill it. I would not let myself be only a victim in a story written by other people. I would become the author, slow, precise, ruthless when necessary. For Ethan. For me. I started with the obvious: knowledge. If you want to pull the rug out from under someone, you first study the floorboards. I read everything I could find about arson investigations, insurance fraud, and probate law. The internet at 3 in the morning became my confessional and my classroom. I made notes in a battered notebook, a timeline of Daniel and Lila's movements, copies of receipts, names of people to call, and legal clauses that might matter. I circled the life insurance policy with a pen until the ink bled through the page. Double payout for accidental fire. The phrase thrummed in my head like a heartbeat. Next came allies. I am not the sort of person who brags about who I can call, but revenge is not a solitary sport. It's a small army of favors and quiet truths. I reached out to people I trusted, not for pity, but for competence. There was Mara, my childhood friend who worked the night shift at the hospital and knew how to coax information out of tired staff. There was Aaron, a former colleague who still did odd IT work and owed me a favor from a time I'd covered for him. And there was Detective Ruiz, a police officer with a soft spot for the overlooked. I fed him what I could without ever revealing the full pile of cards I held. I told myself I was being pragmatic. But I also felt a darker satisfaction in lining up help. It felt like assembling tools. Each person had a function. Mara could speak to witnesses who might have been nervous the night of the fire. Aaron could pull metadata from photographs and recovered files. Ruiz could prod the official file when it started to stall. I gave each of them small, believable reasons to act: a neighbor worried about arson, a coroner's report that didn't sit right, and watched how the machine of scrutiny began to turn. At home, I rehearsed. Not theatrically, this was quieter, internal practice. I practiced how to appear vulnerable in public while seeding doubt in private conversations. People underestimate how much performance matters. At the funeral, I had been the gentle martyr. At community meetings, I was the grieving guardian. But behind closed doors I practiced a different face, the one that could deliver cold facts with a calm voice, the one that could ask the right blunt question to the right person at the right time. I learned to smile in a way that disarmed and to move in a way that suggested the chaos had not swallowed me. Masks are not lies, they are instruments. I sharpened them. I also trained in patience. Revenge done in heat is revenge wasted. I waited for patterns, scanned their small habits for consistent weakness. Lila loved luxury, she could not hide her taste for expensive things. Daniel had always bragged about being careful with money but not with love. Greed had a way of showing itself in ledgers, in late-night calls about policies, in messages about fixing everything with a quick payout. My plan would not be an explosion. It would be a slow erosion, like water cutting stone. One of my most important moves was to transform Ethan's vulnerability into a fortress. I did not want him to be a bargaining chip or a tragic headline. I enrolled him in therapy, yes, but also in the small rituals of safety: a pediatrician I trusted, a school placement that would give him stability, extracurriculars where he could be just a kid. I learned to make his world predictable. Children heal in routines and laughs and scrape-knee stories, not in headlines. Every time he smiled because he'd found a toy in his backpack or learned a new word, I felt my resolve steal into something tender and enormous. He had to be the reason I stayed clean in my methods. My revenge could not be cruelty, it had to be correction. Practicalities demanded attention. I opened new accounts under my name and a trust for Ethan. I met with the attorney more often than I let on. I changed some locks, updated insurance, and quietly applied for temporary social support to give us breathing room. The last thing I needed was for my fight to be sabotaged by bureaucracy because I'd overlooked a form. Preparation, I learned, has dignity. Then came the more delicate operation, reputation management. People still defended Daniel and Lila in whispers. They wanted to believe. People do that to protect themselves from the idea that evil can live in comfortable homes. So I began to nudge truths into public view in small, calibrated doses. A comment to a coffee shop acquaintance about seeing Lila at a boutique with fresh flowers. An offhand remark to a cousin about hearing Daniel brag to a coworker about an incredible plan before the accident. I never lied, I only highlighted the already suspicious. Gossip is lightning if you strike a building dry enough. I ensured the wood around Daniel and Lila's names was tinder. There were risks. Each move had a cost. A friend could turn away, a detective could stop listening, a rumor could backfire. I slept with those risks like stones in my bed, weighed them, turned them over, and kept the ones I could live with. I never crossed the line into illegal acts. Arson accusations are messy and reckless if you don't have ironclad proof. I would not be a monster, I was too careful for that. My fight would be within the law and beyond the echo chamber of pity. Emotionally, the work changed me. There were nights when I crawled into the floor like a wounded animal, sobs racking me until I could not breathe. There were other nights when I felt like an architect, drafting the outlines of a life that would not bend to their betrayals. Both selves existed, jagged and true. I learned to hold both without breaking. As the weeks passed, my mailbox gathered small victories. A background check on a contractor who'd been at the house the week before the fire returned a name with a suspicious past. Aaron recovered metadata showing the cafe photo had been taken from a specific angle that pointed to a person I'd never considered, someone who had access to both Daniel's schedule and the house's wiring. Detective Ruiz called, voice low and professional, saying they were reopening certain lines of inquiry. I watched how small facts made the bigger machine move. It was intoxicating in the same way that knowing a secret can be: power, yes, but also weight. Through it all, I kept building a new home for Ethan. We baked cookies that tasted like victory for reasons only a child and I would understand. We painted a mural with crooked trees and a sun that never set. I told him stories about brave knights and clever foxes, and in those stories I hid lessons about truth and courage. He asked me once why his parents had not come back, and I answered with a honesty shaped by care: some people make terrible choices. But you're safe now. He nodded, accepted the explanation with the solemnity only children have, and the world felt both smaller and larger at once. My plan was no longer hypothetical. It was a map with routes and contingencies, a ledger of small acts that would, in time, add up to a reckoning. I tucked the printed copies of messages and policies into the envelope labeled when and slid it further into the drawer. The word had become a calendar I kept in my chest. Revenge, I understood now, is not always about the spectacle. Often, it is about the meticulous reclamation of what was stolen: reputation, safety, a child's future. It is about making sure that a life built on betrayal cannot stand. I would not look triumphant when their world fell apart. I would look steady. I would look like a woman who had done what needed to be done. And when the time came, when the small evidences accumulated into a mountain that could not be ignored, I would open that drawer and take out the envelope. Until then, I would prepare, protect, and wait with the patience of someone who has learned that storms are weathered by those who keep their roofs mended. Ethan stirred in his sleep as I closed the laptop and turned off the light. I leaned over him and kissed his forehead. "We're going to be okay," I whispered, and I meant it. Not because the world had become kind, but because I had become unbreakable. By now, the world thought I was a grieving widow, a gentle mother figure struggling to find her footing after a tragedy that had left my home and my heart in ashes. They saw the soft edges, the tears, the careful attention to Ethan. They didn't see the engine of planning that was quietly humming behind every polite smile and measured word. That engine was fueled by something else entirely: a desire for justice, or perhaps, a reckoning that would feel like justice. The first moves were subtle. Small questions dropped in conversation, faint suggestions that made people notice the cracks in Daniel and Lila's story. I wasn't loud. I wasn't confrontational. I was a whisper in a room full of believers. "Did you see Lila at that boutique last week?" I asked casually to a neighbor I knew would repeat the comment. "Oh yes," she replied. "She looked distracted, didn't she?" I smiled softly, sipping my coffee. Distracted. That was the word I wanted to spread. Suspicious, inattentive, careless. I began planting evidence in plain sight, strategically leaving documents or messages where the right people could find them. I never manipulated them directly, only guided the world's eye. I watched as subtle curiosity turned into a quiet investigation by others. People began to notice, connect dots they had ignored before, and the web that Daniel and Lila had spun for years started to fray. Inside, I was patient, methodical. I knew the timing of my strikes would matter more than their intensity. A wrong move too early, and I risked losing everything: the legal leverage, the moral high ground, even Ethan's stability. My plan was to make them expose themselves, piece by piece, while I remained the calm, collected observer. I also used my public persona carefully. At community gatherings, I was still the bereaved woman, polite, careful, always smiling just enough. But the eyes that met mine noticed something else. A quiet confidence. A subtle assertion that I was not to be underestimated. People responded unconsciously. They deferred to me, included me in conversations, asked for my opinion. Each nod, each invitation, each acknowledgement was a small victory. At the same time, I maintained my private operations. I reviewed the screenshots and recordings I had collected, double-checked metadata, and organized my notes. I contacted Mara and Aaron with coded updates, small insights, questions they could follow up on without revealing my full hand. Detective Ruiz continued his inquiries quietly, unaware that the data I fed him was part of a larger design. I learned to play with emotions as a weapon. Daniel's pride was a lever, Lila's vanity a fulcrum. I observed their patterns, how they reacted when people whispered behind their backs, how quickly they tried to cover minor slips. Each slip became a thread I could tug at. Each reaction, a clue to the next move. And all the while, Ethan grew more secure. His presence was the anchor that kept my darker impulses in check. I would not let the desire for vengeance become cruelty. I wanted him safe, protected, and happy. My revenge would be surgical, precise, and just, the kind that ensured the guilty could not harm again, without letting my conscience erode. The first major psychological maneuver came when Lila's friends began asking questions. I casually mentioned, in a tone heavy with unspoken curiosity, "It's strange how Daniel's messages disappeared so quickly, isn't it?" People started talking. Speculation quietly made its way back to Lila, eroding her confidence and sense of control. I did not have to lift a finger beyond observation. The seeds I planted began to sprout. One evening, I stood at the window with Ethan asleep in his room. The fire from months ago still haunted me, but now it was also a reminder of purpose. I realized that my revenge wasn't just about exposing betrayal, it was about building a new order where truth, responsibility, and integrity mattered. The world could be cruel, yes, but I would bend it so that the consequences of cruelty were unavoidable. I whispered to myself, "This is only the beginning. Let them underestimate me. Let them continue to believe I am broken. That will be their greatest mistake." And in that quiet night, I smiled. Not a smile of cruelty, but one of resolve. Because I knew, deep in my heart, that the first moves in a long, meticulous game had already been made, and the next steps would come like shadows, silent, inevitable, and unavoidable. The air seemed thinner these days, as if the town itself were holding its breath waiting for something to break. Every conversation hummed with quiet speculation. People who used to nod politely at my smile now glanced sideways when Daniel's name came up, and Lila's laughter began to sound brittle, like glass someone might drop at any moment. That was the sound I wanted to hear, their composure cracking under pressure I had set in motion. I stepped up the pressure carefully, like turning a dial only a degree at a time. Too much, too fast, and I risked catastrophe for Ethan and myself. Too slow, and Daniel and Lila might regroup, patch their reputations with brittle apologies, and retreat into a life stitched together with other people's pity. The challenge was to make the unraveling feel inevitable, not manufactured. One of my first moves in this phase was to make their small mistakes public without looking like I had done it. I started by donating a memorial bench to the park in the burned house's name, an ostensibly kind act that served as a subtle reminder. I arranged for the plaque to include dates and the words, "In memory of those lost in unexpected tragedy." People who passed the bench read it and murmured. The addition was innocuous enough to avoid suspicion but prominent enough to keep the tragedy, and the questions about it, in circulation. Next, I used social media as a scalpel. I didn't smear or accuse, I curated. Old photos of Daniel smiling at business events were shared with comments about how life can hide storms behind a friendly grin. Lila's posts about shopping sprees got discreet replies from acquaintances asking gently about priorities. Curious minds began to poke. People started to compare timelines, and where there had been comfort before, there was now inquiry. The town loves a tidy story. I gave it pieces that wouldn't fit together neatly. At the same time, I tightened the legal noose. Detective Ruiz called more often, each conversation shorter and more urgent. He'd found an inconsistency in the insurance application. Someone had initialed a clause in ink that didn't match the sample signature. He also mentioned a contractor who had been in and out of the house in the weeks before the fire, a subcontractor whose records were oddly incomplete. My files and the detective's findings began to echo each other like two instruments tuning to the same pitch. I made sure each revelation was logged, documented, and nudged into public record in the right way. They began to show cracks. Lila's friend started drifting away, first subtly, an uninvited silence at brunch, a missed text, and then more directly. At one memorial service, a woman who had once been Lila's closest confidant refused to sit beside her. Watching Lila's surprised face in that pew felt almost like justice, the realization entering her eyes that social currency could evaporate faster than any wardrobe. Daniel's corporate contacts grew distant as well. Deals that were once within reach were postponed with the polite language of cautious advisors. I had quietly reached out to a couple of his clients, just enough to plant questions about his reliability. Business is survival by reputation, remove that, and the rest follows. He tried to keep his face composed in public, but I saw him at the grocery store the way people look at accidents, curious, guilty, and afraid. Sometimes, their panic leaked into small, human mistakes. Lila left a receipt in the trash of the cafe where she met someone the night before the fire, a name scribbled on the back that didn't belong to any friend. Daniel once called my house and, in a moment he thought private, asked someone on the other end, "Did she see the policy?" I had been recording the times he slipped. Little humiliations piled up inside them like rent notices, small, insistent reminders that no one else would ever really trust them again. Inside me, the satisfaction of watching their world tilt was occasionally punctured by a deeper, quieter fear. Revenge is a patient vice, but it is still a vice. Night after night I asked myself whether the person I was becoming would be a comfort or a cautionary tale to Ethan. I kept my darker impulses fenced, no violence, no public shaming beyond the truth I had unearthed. But the temptation to let my anger scorch everything in a single, blazing moment sometimes burned bright and dangerous. It took will to step back and shape my retaliation into consequence rather than ruin. There was also the stray mercy that appeared in unexpected places. Once, Lila's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, brought over a pie and sat with Ethan for an hour, telling him stories about the neighborhood before the town had shopping malls and before people locked their doors at night. She spoke of forgiveness like it was a recipe, small, patient measures, and then everything tasted different. Listening to her, I felt something loosen inside my chest, a reminder that my revenge would also have to accommodate mercy if I wanted to keep my soul intact. But these moments of softness did not derail me. If anything, they sharpened my aim. I wanted consequences that felt like lessons, not cruelty for cruelty's sake. I wanted Daniel and Lila to lose the safety nets they had taken for granted, not to be destroyed, but to stand in the rubble of their choices and see what they had done. The pressure I applied began to find legal traction. The insurance company reopened the claim after Detective Ruiz forwarded my files and flagged discrepancies. An investigator for the insurer called to ask more pointed questions about beneficiary changes and policy timing. A forensic accountant notified the estate lawyer that some transactions needed auditing. Each official step was a brick in the foundation of accountability I was building. It also made the stakes higher, which meant their panic grew. The panic manifested most vividly the night there was a break-in at Lila's apartment. Her neighbor called me in a flurry because she knew I would be concerned. Police came, and nothing of value had been taken, but Lila's photographs were strewn about and her closet ransacked, a grotesque display meant to frighten rather than rob. The town whispered about it for days. Some suspected someone had meant to intimidate her, others wondered if it was staged. I watched from the edges, my chest tight, unsure whether this was some covert retaliation from a friend of theirs, an angry stranger, or something more calculated. I would not let it give me an excuse to cross a line. But it underscored one truth: the pressure cooker was reaching temperature. And yet, there were moments when the world surprised me with fragile beauty. One afternoon, Ethan found an injured sparrow by the fence. He carried it into the house with solemn reverence and asked if we could fix it. We patched its wing with tape and cotton, fed it crumbs, and watched it regain courage to flutter away. We clapped and celebrated as if we'd saved a person. In that small ceremony, I recognized the architecture of the life I wanted to construct: mending, not annihilation. As the weeks progressed, the town's whispers consolidated into a quieter, more insistent chorus. Questions about the fire were no longer polite curiosities. They were the subject of hushed conversations at the grocery store, clipped emails, and the kind of scrutiny that peels varnish from reputations. Daniel and Lila retreated into lists of angry legal threats and shaky interviews. They tried to take the high ground in statements that read like apologies and denials, but public trust is a fragile object once cracked. At night, with Ethan asleep and the house finally feeling like ours, would sit at the kitchen table and read the reports again. I'd trace the lines of timelines and cross-reference receipts. There were still gaps, blind spots I needed filled. I tapped Aaron for another sweep of recovered metadata, and he promised he was on it. He was good at finding the things people thought deleted forever. The tension was no longer simply mine. It lived in small rooms and long hallways in the town. It hung in the air between neighbors. It lay in the way people at the school pickup glanced when my car rolled up. They waited, perhaps, for the moment when the avalanche I had nudged would become unstoppable. I did not want an avalanche. I wanted inevitable consequence, slow, inevitable, and clean. But as the pressure rose, I felt the weight of potential collateral damage bend my spine toward caution. I reminded myself, daily, of the reasons: Ethan's laugh, the way he still held my finger with trust, the small rituals that would heal him. That is how I navigated the precarious balance, how to make them feel the impact of their choices without losing myself in the fallout. The next moves had to be surgical. I had to make the proof speak to people who would not be swayed by gossip or pity: lawyers, accountants, the press. I would not yell, I would show. And when I did, there would be no theatrics, only facts arranged like a line of dominoes, each one knocking the next until the truth had to stand naked before the town. I closed the file, smoothed the papers, and tucked the envelope marked one back into its drawer. The word was a small clock I kept in my chest. The town might be holding its breath, but I was not waiting for fate. I was building it, piece by meticulous piece. The storm was coming. There is a strange kind of work that grief requires, one that no one prepares you for and no one applauds. It is the slow, patient labor of stitching a life back together one careful seam at a time. After months of collecting proof and quietly nudging the town toward the truth, I discovered that the most urgent battle was not with Daniel or Lila anymore. It was with the hollow left behind in my chest and with the small human who now called me Mom. Ethan taught me how to do the tiny, life-saving rituals. He taught me how to make pancakes with lopsided smiles and how to build forts from couch cushions that could withstand any imaginary dragon. He taught me that mornings could be full of marvel again: sunlight, cereal, a paper plane that always crashed in the same deceitful way. Those rituals became our medicine. When the news about the insurance inquiry came through and I felt the old hunger for retribution flare, I would look at Ethan's sticky hands and the way he giggled at his own shadow and remember that whatever I did next had to be with him in mind. Therapy helped, too, at least, the version of it that felt right for me. I did not speak in the antiseptic language of sessions at first, I spoke in the truer dialect of small tasks. We went to a child psychologist who smelled like markers and rain. He handed Ethan a stack of crayons and asked him to draw his favorite place. Ethan drew a house with a crooked chimney and a sun with a smile, and beneath it, a tiny stick family holding hands. I sat beside him and watched, and for a sliver of time the world's edges softened. I also allowed myself to grieve properly. There were afternoons when I would let the tears come without turning them into fuel for revenge, when I would sit on the floor in the quiet and remember better days without pretending that those memories did not hurt. Those afternoons were not weakness, they were cleansing. They were the means by which I could return to my work without my bones hollowed out. As I healed, I also rebuilt our home. It is a curious thing how physical spaces can reflect the interior. I replaced curtains that smelled of smoke with curtains that smelled like linen and rain. We painted the living room in a soft, steady blue and filled the shelves with books that had friendly covers and practical heroes. I bought a second-hand rocking chair that creaked in a way that felt honest. Each object acted like a small flag of normalcy, proof for Ethan that the world still had room for simple comforts. One of the biggest acts of rebuilding was returning to work. Not because I needed the money, though the bills do accumulate in their own indifferent way, but because being useful outside the house reminded me I was not defined solely by the fire or by betrayal. I took on freelance projects that let me move my mind into problem solving that wasn't soluble in anger. The tasks provided a rhythm. Rhythm is underrated in recovery, it is a scaffold for days that might otherwise collapse into shapeless mourning. In tandem with rebuilding, I continued the quiet legal work that would ensure long-term safety. The investigator from the insurance company had been persistent. New questions about the policy's beneficiary and timing kept surfacing. Detective Ruiz sent me short, clipped messages, "Keep everything. Be ready." It was both a comfort and a reminder that the world I was constructing for Ethan depended on these slow, sometimes tedious processes. There were tender milestones, too, the first time Ethan called me Mom, without prompting, the first time he fell asleep clutching a stuffed rabbit he insisted on naming Brave, the first night he laughed so hard he snorted and we both dissolved into the kind of laughter that stitches people back together. Each milestone felt like a small exorcism of the days that had burned us. I also found an odd and necessary kindness in routine acts of charity. I volunteered at a shelter once a week, helping with meal distributions. It was not at all heroic, mostly stirring soup and listening to people talk about small troubles, but it made me feel connected. It taught me that my desire for justice could coexist with the impulse to help. Those evenings, when I ladled soup and handed out warm bread, I felt less like a woman on a vendetta and more like someone accountable to a wider world. Even as I tended the domestic, I trained myself to notice mercy in the most unlikely places. Once, Mrs. Donnelly, the old neighbor who had brought the pie months earlier, sent over a small envelope with a note that simply said, "For Ethan. For new beginnings." Inside was a supply of old children's books and a $50 grocery card. No questions, no expectations. A kindness without a ledger. I cried then, not from rage, but from the ache of being seen without pretense. But I never let the building of a new life soften my edge completely. Patience had become its own muscle, I exercised it daily. I kept the when envelope tucked away, and I checked my backups as if they were heirlooms. I continued to meet discreetly with Aaron, reviewing recovered metadata and discussing the timing of the disclosures we would make. I consulted with my lawyer about how to present the evidence in ways that would be irrefutable and would protect Ethan's privacy. The work had evolved, it was no longer the raw hunger for exposure, it was strategic, surgical, and parentally protective. One evening, as Ethan did a sloppy crayon portrait of our house, this time with a bright blue door and a smiling sun, I found my hands trembling with a strange gratitude. There was the truth, I had been forged in fire, and out of that heat something steady had emerged. Not the same person I had been before. Some parts of that woman had been irreparably burned away, but something perhaps wiser, more careful, and more determined to shape the future gently. I began to tell Ethan stories about resilience rather than revenge. In those stories, characters stumbled and sometimes hurt each other, but they also learned to make amends, to care for survivors, and to rebuild stronger houses. He listened, eyes wide, and sometimes he would offer plot twists like any child, and the dragon learned to cook pancakes. It was small and absurd and perfect. I also prepared for the day the evidence would be laid bare. I imagined that day not as a triumphal parade but as a clearing, a moment when truth would be present and responsibility would be demanded. I would stand not on a stage of vindication but on the quiet ground of a woman who had protected a child and ensured the law and community saw what had been done. For now, much of my life was ordinary in a way that felt miraculous. Ethan and I shopped for winter coats, we argued over whether pancakes were better with syrup or fruit, and we watched bad nature documentaries that he loved for the dramatic music and I loved for his earnest questions. Each ordinary day was a stitch that held. Each ordinary laugh was a seal against the past. I am not healed completely, who is? But I have learned to carry memory without being defined by it. I have learned that the noblest kind of revenge is often the one that produces life rather than ruin. I was building that life for Ethan and for myself, and in doing so I found something that revenge alone could not have given me, a purpose that included mercy, a home that radiated safety, and the steady conviction that truth, when coupled with care, has a force both terrible and beautiful. When I tucked Ethan in that night and watched him breathe, I whispered into the darkness, "Sleep, little one. We are safe. We will do this right." The world outside was still a place of rumors and investigations and slow reckonings. Inside, in our patched-up house, we were learning to be a family again, quietly, stubbornly, with open hands and steady hearts. The day the truth finally stepped out of the shadows did not arrive with fireworks or thunder. It came like the quiet shift of a tide, steady, unstoppable, and impossible to ignore. It started with a call from Detective Ruiz early in the morning. His voice was low but charged with something that made my chest tighten. "Sophia, we have what we need. The insurance company is moving forward. There will be hearings. And, there's more. Daniel's signature on the policy? Forged. Funds were being transferred to an offshore account in Lila's name." I sat at the kitchen table, my hands gripping a lukewarm mug of coffee. Ethan played with his toy cars in the living room, oblivious to the quiet earthquake happening a few feet away. My heart raced, not from fear, but from the recognition that months of careful patience were about to pay off. The first news story appeared online that afternoon. Local couple under investigation for insurance fraud and arson. My breath caught when I read their names printed in bold. Daniel. Lila. Neighbors who had once whispered only in private now shared the article like a wildfire. Text messages pinged relentlessly. "Did you see this? Unbelievable. I can't believe they could do something like this." The comments poured in, shocked emojis, accusations, disbelief. The quiet murmurs I had nurtured for months had become a roaring public chorus. But the true confrontation was still ahead. That evening, Daniel showed up at my door. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. The confident, polished man I had once married was gone. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. He looked like someone who had been awake for days, someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling faster than he could catch the pieces. "Sophia, please. We need to talk." I kept my voice steady. "There's nothing left to talk about." He tried to step closer, but I held the doorframe like a shield. Behind me, Ethan's small shadow flickered in the hallway. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Daniel said, his voice cracking. Lila, she said we could start over. The fire it wasn't supposed to be that bad. We just needed the money. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." The words fell like ash between us. My mind flashed to the night of the fire, to Ethan's terrified cries, to the choking smoke. He never meant for anyone to get hurt. And yet he had risked everything. You set the fire? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Daniel flinched. It was an accident. No, it was supposed to be controlled. Just enough to trigger the insurance. We thought, he broke off, running a trembling hand through his hair. It got out of control. I swear I didn't know Ethan was there. I thought he was at your house. My stomach twisted, not from surprise but from the confirmation of what I had already suspected. You almost killed your own son, I said coldly. You betrayed me. You betrayed him. And now you want me to feel sorry for you? He tried to reach for my hand, but I stepped back. You should leave, Daniel. The detectives will handle the rest. For a moment he looked like he might argue, but something in my eyes must have told him it was over. He lowered his hand, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of a reality he could no longer deny. Without another word, he turned and walked away, the night swallowing his silhouette. When I closed the door, Ethan peeked from the hallway. Was that Daddy? I knelt down, gathering him into my arms. Yes, sweetheart, I whispered. But he can't stay. Some people make dangerous choices. And when they do, the truth has to come out so everyone can be safe. Ethan nodded against my shoulder, too young to understand all the words, but wise enough to feel the gravity. The hearings began the next week. I didn't testify first. The investigators presented the evidence: forged documents, suspicious bank transfers, deleted messages Aaron had helped me recover. Every piece of data, every photograph, every carefully saved file was like a domino clicking into place. Lila sat stiff in the courtroom, her face pale beneath heavy makeup. She avoided my gaze, staring instead at the table as if the wood grain could swallow her whole. Daniel kept glancing at me with eyes that pleaded for something: mercy, understanding, or perhaps the version of me he had once manipulated. But there was no mercy in the truth. The judge ordered a full audit of their finances and set a date for criminal charges. The insurance company froze their accounts. Their lawyer asked for extensions, but the evidence was too heavy, too precise. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones thrust forward. Miss Carter, did you know about the fraud before the fire? Do you have a statement about your sister's involvement? Are you concerned about your child's safety? I kept my answers measured, steady. My priority is my son's well-being. The investigators have the facts. The truth will speak for itself. Behind me, flashbulbs popped like distant fireworks. Each click was a small, cold victory, not for my ego, but for justice. That night, when the house was finally quiet, I sat with Ethan in the living room. He traced patterns on my hand with his tiny fingers, a habit he developed when he needed reassurance. Are we safe now? He asked. I kissed his forehead. Yes, I said softly. We're safe. And the truth is out. He smiled sleepily, his eyes closing as he nestled against me. I watched him breathe, feeling the storm that had once raged inside me settle into something steadier, calmer. Revenge had brought us here, yes, but it was the truth, not the fury, that would protect us in the end. Outside, the night air carried the distant sound of sirens, but for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. The truth was no longer a weapon. It was a shield. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day peeling back another layer of deception. Daniel and Lila's lawyers fought hard, but the evidence was a fortress they couldn't climb. The forged insurance documents. The offshore accounts. The testimony from the fire inspectors who confirmed accelerants had been used. Piece by piece, their plan, so carefully plotted, crumbled under the weight of truth. I attended every hearing. Not out of spite, but because I needed to see justice carried to the very end. Each morning, I dressed with quiet precision, held Ethan's hand, and walked past the reporters whose cameras flashed like lightning. Each night, I returned home to the soft rhythm of a child's breathing and the small, sacred knowledge that we were building something stronger than revenge. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom held its breath. Daniel was sentenced to 15 years for arson, insurance fraud, and reckless endangerment. Lila received 10 for conspiracy and fraud. The judge's gavel struck like a thunderclap, final and absolute. Daniel turned in his seat to look at me as the bailiffs moved in. His eyes searched mine, desperate for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe recognition of the life we once shared. I gave him nothing but silence. He had burned more than a house. He had burned the bridge back to the person I used to be. Lila didn't look at me at all. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. No sudden flood of relief, no triumphant music swelling in the background. Just stillness. Healing, I realized, isn't loud. It's the slow reclaiming of mornings, the gentle return of laughter to a house that once echoed with fear. Ethan began to thrive. His nightmares faded, replaced by dreams of superheroes and rocket ships. He started kindergarten that fall, his small backpack bouncing as he ran to meet new friends. Sometimes, when he thought I wasn't watching, he'd stop and glance back at me with a smile, an unspoken promise that we were moving forward together. Aaron remained a steady presence. He never asked for credit, never tried to take the spotlight. He was simply there, helping fix a leaky faucet, bringing over takeout when the day felt too heavy, reading Ethan bedtime stories when my voice faltered. One evening, as we watched Ethan build a tower of blocks, Aaron reached for my hand. No words. Just a quiet connection that felt like the beginning of something real. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future. One crisp autumn morning, I drove to the lot where my old house once stood. The charred ruins had been cleared, leaving only an open stretch of earth and the faint smell of smoke that seemed to linger in memory more than air. I stood there for a long time, the cold wind tugging at my hair, and let the silence speak. This was where it had all ended. And where it had begun. I thought about the woman I had been before the fire, trusting, blind to betrayal. I thought about the woman I had been during the storm, angry, relentless, consumed by the need for justice. And I thought about the woman standing there now, strong, unbroken, no longer defined by what had been stolen from her. Revenge had been the spark, yes. But it was love, love for Ethan, love for truth, love for the life still ahead, that had carried me through the fire. I knelt, pressed my palm to the cool earth, and whispered a promise to myself. This is not an ending. This is the foundation of something new. As I walked back to the car, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden beams across the empty lot. For the first time in a long, dark season, I felt it fully, the warmth of a future untouched by smoke. Ethan was waiting at home. And so was the rest of my life.